Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Angel Resendez. Also known as the Railroad Killer, Angel is said to have committed somewhere around 23 horrific crimes during his spree in both the United States and Mexico in the 1990s. He went on to become known as the Railroad Killer because of the fact that most of his crimes were committed near railroads, where he had just jumped off of trains he was using to travel around the country. Most of his crimes took place in the homes of those he harmed, and usually after the crimes he'd linger around to eat their food and sometimes steal their sentimental items. Sometimes he'd even take jewelry to re-gift to his mother and sister. In June of 1999, he was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and when his sister saw him there, she was worried he would continue harming people, so she thankfully contacted the authorities. After this, they were able to convince him to surrender and he was sent to trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death by the jury, and although there were multiple appeal attempts, his death warrant was signed, and on June 27, 2006, he received his sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who used Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in this case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At the same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully this case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Chase. This evil person is said to have taken the lives of 6 people within the span of a month between 1977 and 1978. That's a lot of people in a very short amount of time, which is absolutely terrifying. Before his crimes, Richard's life was already full of terrible stories and horrific acts that had him spending time in mental institutions before his crime spree. While at these facilities, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but after going through treatment and beginning medication, he was deemed to no longer be a threat to society and was released into his mother's care. Here's where things take a turn for the worse, however. Instead of helping take care of Richard, his mother instead weaned him off of his medication and got him all set up with his own apartment. Nice. Really helpful and cool of her. Initially, when he moved into the apartment, he had roommates, but eventually they all moved out and he was alone, which is when things really got wild. He began killing various animals, which he would then eat raw, sometimes mixing the organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and then drinking it. It's horrible. After this, he would unfortunately go on his killing spree, which had horrific details and would only end when he was startled by a visitor at the home of where his final crime took place. He fled the scene, but he was later caught and stood trial. Although there were many attempts to have him be spared of the death sentence, in the end this didn't work. In December of 1980, Richard was found passed away in his jail cell after taking too many of his prescribed medication. In our number 7 spot today, we have Rodney Alcala. Rodney is a horrible monster who was convicted and sentenced to death for 5 killings that he committed in California from 1977 to 1979. He also received an additional 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 other killings in New York in 1971 and 1977. Rodney got away with his crimes for a while because he wasn't the top of the list of suspects, because he was said to be the quote charming photographer. Rodney is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the show, which, with what we now know about him, is absolutely horrifying. What's crazy is that he actually won the show he was on, but the episode's bachelorette refused to go on a date with him because she found him creepy. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. It isn't exactly known just how many victims Rodney had. It is potentially thought that it could be much higher than the number he was convicted for. In July of last year, Rodney passed away in prison at the age of 77. In our number 6 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40, he just couldn't remember the names of all of them. But, of course, he could remember the details of all of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only one count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted for 25 minutes straight, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable. In our number 5 spot today, we have John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. This pair is referred to as the DC Snipers, and they were responsible for a series of coordinated attacks during a 3-week period in October of 2002. The pair took the lives of 10 people and critically injured 3 others during this spree, although their crimes spanned even before this and involved even more people. Their crimes were random and terrifying. People would just be going about their everyday tasks when this horrific pair would strike. Through a series of quote-unquote mistakes the pair made, they were able to be caught by authorities and arrested. In September of 2003, John Allen was sentenced to death, and this sentence was carried out in November of 2009. John Lee, on the other hand, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, but very recently it was determined that his sentence needs to be re-looked at because of his young age when the crimes were committed. In our number 4 spot today, we have Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. A 2-for-1 of the most horrific kind, this pair was often referred to as the toolbox killers. They received this name because most of what they used to commit their crimes would be items normally stored in a household toolbox. The pair committed 5 of these crimes in Southern California over a 5-month period in 1979. In the end, what led to their capture was when Roy met up with a friend with whom he had previously been incarcerated with. He confessed to the crimes to this person in great detail, and you know what this person did? They consulted their attorney about this horrifying confession, who then advised them to go to the authorities with the information. Thank goodness. Authorities, while they didn't have the evidence necessary to charge the men with the crimes at that time, were able to, through surveillance, find other things to arrest them for, while they searched their homes to find the evidence that they really did need. The pair stood trial, and in the end, Lawrence was sentenced to death, and Roy, who accepted a plea bargain and agreed to testify against Lawrence, received a life sentence. Lawrence died of natural causes while on death row in December of 2019, as did Roy at the California Medical Facility in 2020. FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas described Lawrence as the most disturbing individual for whom he has ever created a criminal profile. In our number 3 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. Robert is often referred to as the Butcher Baker, and his story truly is horrific. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness, where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling the streets at night. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Paulson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today, we have William Bonin. This horrible person is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 21 young men in Southern California from May of 1979 to June 1980. It is said that on at least 12 of these occasions he was assisted by one of his 4 known accomplices, and it is even speculated that he might be responsible for 15 more of these crimes that evidence hasn't officially been able to connect him to. He was often referred to as the freeway killer because of the fact that most of the bodies were found along the freeway of Southern California. The police surveilled William until they could catch him in the act, which they did. In the beginning he claimed innocence. I mean, they caught him in the act, it's kind of dumb to claim innocence, but after receiving an impassioned letter from one of the victim's mothers, which asked him to please share the location of her son's body, he confessed his guilt. But he made sure to clarify that it wasn't so the mother could be at peace or so that her pain could be eased. No, of course not. Instead, he said, quote, "I was dying for a hamburger and I knew if I went out with the cops they would get me a hamburger." At his first trial, the prosecutor described him as, quote, "the most arch-evil person who ever existed." William was convicted on 14 of his crimes and was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before his sentence was carried out in 1996. In our number 1 spot today we have Israel Keyes. Israel is quite a prolific serial killer and truly is a terrifying person. While everyone on this list is horrible, Israel is particularly scary because of the fact that he had no MO or type. He just killed at random. In fact, he was so prepared for these random crimes that he left kill kits all over the US so that he would be prepared for whenever whoever he chose crossed his path. It isn't quite clear how many of these crimes he committed, and many missing persons reports that are still open could potentially be linked to him. It is said that Israel had a sort of admiration and obsession with other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy or Robert Hansen, who we already talked about today. He even said, quote, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." So creepy. In March of 2012, Israel was finally apprehended and was to stand trial for his crimes, but unfortunately while waiting for trial, he went on to take his own life. He left behind a note and a drawing of 11 skulls, which led authorities to believe that this may be the number of victims he had. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Quincy Allen. Quincy Allen is a man who went on a crime spree between July and August of 2002 where he took the lives of 4 people. His crime spree was actually inspired while he was in prison serving time for stealing a vehicle. It was here that a fellow inmate decided to start recruiting others and told him that he could get Quincy a job as a mafia hitman. When Quincy was released, he decided to buy a shotgun so he could start practicing. Man, I really wish he showed this kind of dedication to literally anything else. Quincy started off this horrific crime spree on July 7th, 2002 by attacking a 51-year-old homeless man who was sleeping at the time. Luckily, this man was able to survive the attack. His crimes continued until he was arrested on August 14th, 2002. After his arrest and trial, Quincy received a sentence of death and is still on death row awaiting execution. His sentencing did not deter him from the criminal life, however, as in 2009, Quincy, along with another inmate, planned an attack on a correctional officer at the prison they both reside at. Quincy was intended to be executed on January 8th, 2010, but there was a stay of execution that was accepted, and as of July 26th, 2022, literally just over a month ago, Quincy's death sentence was overturned. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer is one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just another level of being messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up though, because it is wild. So you know those like family DNA tests like 23andMe where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these kinds of services helped identify who the real Golden State Killer was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holmes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the Golden State Killer DNA profile, which they were able to obtain from the crime scenes, to the website GED Match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as this DNA match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly collecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James D'Angelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old and will definitely spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 8 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam, is an American serial killer who terrorized New York from July of 1976 to July of 1977. He took the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others, all while eluding the biggest manhunt in New York City history. He was one of those arrogant ones who leaves like little notes for the police promising to do it again, but his arrogant self was caught for his crimes and he was arrested on August 10th, 1977 and was indicted for his crimes. He confessed to all of them and claimed that he was just obeying the orders of a demon that had manifested itself in the form of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. He was found mentally competent to stand trial and he pleaded guilty to his crimes, which left him sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which yeah, duh, but he did say that he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. These claims were investigated, but no one has ever been able to confirm or deny them. In our number 7 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree unalive and 1 count of conspiracy to commit unalive. He originally received a death sentence, but it ended up being commuted to life in prison. Get this, you guys, though, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits, he was able to have 4 children. 4 children. But thankfully in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he got divorced because his wife had met someone else. I hope so. In our number 6 spot today, we have Scott Erskine. Early in life, Scott began to commit violent crimes against others that I truly cannot even speak about here on YouTube, they're so bad. He spent 4 years in prison for one of these crimes when he was around 17 years old, but when he was paroled after the 4 years, he immediately began committing crimes again. In 1993, Scott invited a woman who was waiting for the bus into his home and ended up holding her hostage for several days. After letting her go, he was quickly arrested and ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison. This is when he had to submit DNA to a database, and in March of 2001, that DNA was matched when the cold cases of the unsolved killings of Jonathan Sellers and Charlie Keever were reopened. In 2004, a jury sentenced him to death, and 6 days later he was transferred to San Quentin. In an interesting turn of events, Scott did die on death row, but it wasn't due to a scheduled execution. Scott died a couple of years ago in July of 2020 after contracting COVID-19. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps, using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today, we have Sean Great. Sean is a serial killer who committed a series of crimes from 2006 until he was apprehended in 2016. Throughout his decade of criminal activity, it is thought that he took the lives of at least 5 people. So basically, his story is a little confusing, but in September of 2016, Sean was arrested and later indicted for 2 killings as well as a kidnapping and harming a woman whose 911 call actually led to his arrest. At the same time, in another county next door, he was also being charged with 2 other deaths as well as another one from all the way back in 2016. This final count from all of those years ago was actually an unsolved Jane Doe case who had been unidentified for 12 years. When Sean confessed to this crime, he wasn't even sure who she was, he just said he believed her name was Dana. On May 7th, 2018, Sean was convicted on 2 of the counts, and on March 1st, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the others, and on September 11th, 2019, he pleaded guilty to the additional count. In the end, he was sentenced to death and has remained on death row since that final plea and sentencing, and he is currently scheduled to be executed in 2025. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on this list because while there are a plethora of terrifying people on this list, nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of them all. The Zodiac Killer took the lives of 5 people in the San Francisco Bay Area between 1968 and October of 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples or a lone male cab driver. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. While no one has heard from the Zodiac since 1974, the case remains active in many different counties, and maybe one day we'll finally know who the real Zodiac is. In our number 2 spot today, we have Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman. Known as the serial shooters, the crimes these guys committed are definitely on the list of fears I have, which I'm pretty sure spawned from a Criminal Minds episode. These two were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006. Basically, they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random drive-by shootings. That's the really scary part. The fire thing is also bad, don't get me wrong. There's just something about completely random violence that absolutely terrifies me. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes. In particular, one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, he was found guilty of 80 out of the 87 felony charges that were brought forth, and that was all in one single trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Doodler. While this nickname sounds very sweet, it, like everything else on this list, is very sinister. The nickname that this unidentified killer received is due to his practice of sketching his victims before taking their lives. This unidentified killer committed their crimes in the San Francisco area from January of 1974 to September of 1975, and they specifically targeted gay men. It is believed that 14 deaths can be attributed to this killer, while 3 others were injured in the process. Unfortunately, because of the stigma and sensitivity surrounding gay men at the time, the 3 who survived this monster were very reluctant when speaking with the authorities for fear of being outed as a result of it. This has led to there being very little information for them to work with in terms of identifying the man responsible. For a while, there was a primary suspect, but that person has never been officially charged because sadly, none of the survivors felt comfortable enough to testify in court. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Jacek Jaworek. This is a man who's on the run because of the horrible crimes he committed in July of last year. He took the lives of 3 people who were a part of his own family. One of the family members was able to escape this horrific nightmare and was able to make it safely to the neighbor's house where they could call the authorities for help. Since these horrific crimes, he has gone missing and no one is sure of his whereabouts. Right now it is speculated that he likely escaped from Poland where the crimes took place, but his exact whereabouts remain quite the mystery. In our number 9 spot today, we have the River City Ripper. One of the most terrifying things that exists are serial killers who are still on the loose, especially when you find out that they've been recently active. This serial killer is wanted in connection to 4 different incidents that occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas, 3 of which were fatal. These horrific crimes took place between August of 2020 and April of 2021, and despite one of the victims thankfully surviving the attack and being able to provide a description of the assailant, there is still very little to go on in terms of being able to identify this horrible human. The FBI was contacted shortly after the survivor was able to give a testimony to authorities, and their behavioral analysis team created a profile of this unidentified killer. These crimes are terrible any way you spin them, but one of the most terrifying parts is that they were all just completely random acts of violence that occurred just unprovoked. The case has gained quite a bit of attention, but still, the monster remains at large. In our number 8 spot today, we have Ruja Ignatova. This woman is a convicted fraudster who has been on the run since 2017 after she disappeared when she was found out to be the founder of a Ponzi scheme. The scam, known as OneCoin, which was a scam that was surrounding cryptocurrency, has been referred to as one of the biggest scams in history. US prosecutors have claimed that the scheme was so huge it brought in approximately $4 billion worldwide. Ruja had impeccable timing as she disappeared right at the time that there was a secret US warrant being filed for her arrest. Despite being on the run since 2017, in 2019 she was charged in absentia by US authorities for wire fraud, securities fraud, as well as money laundering. This lady is living the real life Ozark. It's absolutely insane. This case truly is something you'd expect to see on TV, but she's just living it. Despite the years it's been, international authorities are still doing their best to find out where she has been hiding, and this includes raids that have happened just this year. In our number 7 spot today, we have the vending machine killer. Okay, so for this one, we have to know that apparently there are a lot of vending machines in Japan. Like, it's said that there's one for every 23 people. It's a lot of vending machines. So in 1985 in Hiroshima, there were 12 people who passed away and 35 people who were seriously injured from being poisoned with a chemical herbicide. When the string of poisonings were investigated, authorities realized that they had one thing in common, and that was the fact that they had all had the same drink shortly before falling ill. So around the time of this whole thing, there was a company that had launched a marketing campaign where they gave a free drink with every purchase made from a vending machine. When people didn't want their free drink, they would leave it on top of the vending machine for the next person who came along, which is super nice and thoughtful and kind, and of course that means that some horrible person out there had to ruin it for everyone. So, as it turns out, someone was taking these drinks, lacing them with poison, and then leaving them on top of the machines for some random stranger to come around, drink it, and then be sick or unfortunately pass away. It is almost impossible for authorities to be able to track down whoever was doing this, because you have to narrow down where the person picked up the drink, and in 1985 there weren't as many CCTV cameras as there are now. So unfortunately, whoever was responsible for a mass poisoning of strangers is still out there somewhere. In our number 6 spot today we have Jan Marsalek. Jan is said to be a white-collar criminal who fled and went into hiding in June 2020 after the Wirecard scandal, as he was the COO of the company. If you're unfamiliar, Wirecard was a German payment processing firm that had years and years of allegations of malpractice against them. The entire thing really came to a peak in 2019 when the Financial Times published some of the investigations into the complaints, as well as internal documents. In the end, in 2020, Wirecard filed for insolvency after it was realized that 1.9 billion euros were missing. If anyone finds that missing $1.9 billion, my DMs are wide open. It is believed that Jan is one of the main culprits in the entire scandal, and to be fair, fleeing the country doesn't really make you look very innocent. It is believed that he may be located in Russia now, but since August of 2020, Interpol has issued a red notice for him, which requests that worldwide law enforcement be on the lookout for him in order to arrest him, where he can then be extradited. In our number 5 spot today we have Bible John. This is the name used in reference to an unidentified serial killer who was responsible for Scotland's largest manhunt. All 3 of his victims were young brunette women between the ages of 25 to 32, and they had all met him at the Barrel and Ballroom, which was a dance and music venue in Glasgow. Despite this important information, he has never been able to be identified. This was actually the first time in Scotland in which the Crown Office authorized the publication of a composite drawing of the man who was suspected of the crimes. The reason he is called Bible John is said to be because he apparently repeatedly quoted the Bible, which is, I don't know, just really creepy. Most of the key information in the investigation came from one of the victim's sisters, Jean Langford, who had been in the same taxi as her sister and the suspected killer on the night he took her life. She was able to give a description of the man and was able to give information that helped authorities create a profile of him. Despite her incredibly helpful information, he was never able to be caught, and Jean passed away in 2010. While Bible John might have also passed away by now, I still hope that one day authorities can figure out who he was. In our number 4 spot today we have Monica Witt. Monica is a former United States Air Force technical sergeant as well as a defense contractor who has been on the run since 2018. Despite her high-ranking position and high security clearance, she is on the run because she defected to Iran in 2013. It is said that from 2013 up until she was found out that she was using her position in order to spy on the United States and relay that information back to the group she was working for. She used different fake Facebook accounts, and it is said that the information she gave included the classified true name and counterintelligence activities of a US intelligence operative. This is of course a problem regardless of how important this operation was, but it is said that this information she shared had the potential to cause serious damage to the United States national security. It is an absolutely wild story, and Monica is still out there on the run, hiding from the consequences of her betrayal and espionage. In our number 3 spot today we have John Pyle. This horrible human isn't an undercover spy or insane fraudster. He is just a monster who committed certain crimes that are unfortunately a little more common than any of us would like to know. Because of the nature of his crimes, I can't talk about them here in this video, but let's just say that he is definitely one of the worst kinds of criminals out there. On June 24th, 2016, authorities searched his home after after receiving 3 tips relating to his crimes. The amount of and the severity of the incriminating evidence they found during this search ended up landing him charged with 30 different second-degree felonies, which could bring a sentence of 450 years in prison. He was arrested the same day and posted a bail bond of $90,000. Why he was able to get bail, I'll never know. And he also had to surrender his passport. Flash forward 16 months to October 23rd, 2017, and of course, this guy doesn't show up for his hearing, and thus we have a fugitive on the run. Even though he gave up his passport, it is said that he was still somehow able to board a Carnival cruise ship that was bound for Cozumel, Mexico. He got off the ship when it arrived and never reboarded. Despite efforts from international authorities as well as bounty hunters, he has still yet to be located. The last time he was seen was in February of 2018 in Nuevo Leon. In our number 2 spot today, we have Alejandro Castillo. Alejandro is an American man who was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list in October of 2017. He was added to the list after disappearing after taking the life of a woman named Sandy Lai Lee. Sandy was a co-worker of his, and it is said that the two might have briefly dated. Basically, apparently, she had lent him some money that he had never repaid. On August 9th, 2016, Alejandro texted Sandy saying that he would like to repay her, and they agreed to meet at a quick trip. Alejandro was driven to this meeting by Amaya Feaster, who is said to be his new girlfriend. It is believed that once at the meeting, instead of repaying her, Alejandro forced Sandy to take out all of the money from her bank account, which is said to have been about $1,000. After this, the pair drove Sandy to a wooded area, where it is said that he then took her life. After this, the pair fled the scene of the crime and drove from North Carolina to Phoenix, Arizona. They then ended up fleeing into Mexico from there. While Amaya turned herself into authorities on October 20th, 2016, Alejandro remains at large and on the run. Despite the years it's been, I hope that one day he is found so he can be brought to justice for this horrible, senseless crime. In our number 1 spot today, we have Bhadrash Kumar Patel. This is a man who, in 2015, was in the United States in Hanover, Maryland, with his wife Palak. It is said that the pair were traveling to visit relatives and that they had both taken a job at a local Dunkin' Donuts that was owned by one of their family members. It was at this location that on April 12th, 2015, it is said that he took the life of his wife. Surveillance footage shows the two of them walking together in the kitchen around 9:30 p.m. that day before they disappear out of view behind some racks that were in the kitchen. Shortly after this, he reappears alone, turns the oven off, and leaves. Authorities believe that this all may have been over an argument where one of the couple wanted to return to India while the other wanted to stay in the United States. After customers of the store began getting worried when no one came to take their order, they thankfully decided to approach a nearby police officer. The officer went to investigate, and that is when he sadly found her body. The last sighting of him was on April 13th at around 10 a.m. at Newark Penn Station in New Jersey. He had taken a hotel shuttle there and has never been seen since. There is currently a $100,000 reward for information that leads to his whereabouts. It truly is an unimaginable horror, and I hope that this monster is one day brought to justice.
In our number 10 spot, we have Vince Weiguang Li. Vince is a man originally from China and then moved to Canada and officially became a Canadian citizen in 2006. Vince was riding a Greyhound bus in the evening of July 30th, 2008, when he turned to the person sitting beside him, a man named Tim McLean, and he began to harm him, and he proceeded to hold up his head to display to the fellow passengers. He then began to eat Tim, consuming his flesh and most likely his eyes and tongue, as they were never found. Tim, of course, was arrested and went to court and pled not criminally responsible due to insanity. He was put in a high-security mental health facility where he resides today. In our number 9 spot, we have James Douglas. James Douglas was the 3rd Marquis of Queensberry in Scotland in the early 1700s, a Scottish nobleman, if you will. He was known as being an imbecile, or was called violently insane, and was always watched. Apparently in 1707, when the Act of Union was signed, which made the Kingdom of England and Scotland under the same monarchy, there was so much going on that no one actually noticed that James had escaped. He went into the kitchen of his house and took the life of a servant. Apparently he then roasted the servant alive on a revolving pit and then began to eat him. Holy moly, that's terrifying. Apparently, the oven where he cooked the servant can be found today in the Parliament Allowances Office, most likely haunted. In our number 8 spot, we have a man named Terrer. Terrer is a man that was born in France around 1772. He was known as an enigma, a man that could literally eat anything, and he was always hungry. He was never found to be insane, just someone that was always hungry. So hungry that his parents had to disown him because they couldn't afford to feed him. He would also eat the family pets, so I'm sure that was disturbing, and they probably thought him to be evil at the time, just judging by how people thought at that time. Anyways, throughout the years, Terrer actually had some unusual jobs. At one point, he was the warm-up act to a traveling charlatan, swallowing all kinds of animals, stones, cork, and weird objects for show. He then went on to work for the French army, swallowing documents for them. Well, that's one way to dispose of secret documents. Eventually, he agreed to be tested on in a hospital. Unfortunately, he continued his antics here, and they seemingly got worse. He hit a new low and began to eat the corpses in the morgue. Why didn't anyone lock this guy up? This guy could be a vampire or a zombie, maybe a combination of the two. In our number 7 spot, we have Peter Bryan. Peter Bryan is a man that was born in London, England. His parents immigrated there from Barbados. In 2004, Peter was sent to a psychiatric hospital after admitting to killing a 20-year-old shop assistant named Nisha Sheath. In 1995, after being released for God knows what reason, he ate his friend Brian Cherry. Apparently, the police found him cooking a piece of Brian's brain on a frying pan. Peter admitted to eating the brain with butter and that it was really nice. He also admitted that he would have ate someone else had they not shown up, and that he wanted their souls. Ah, lovely. Definitely a real-life zombie. He was of course never released again. You would think that they would never release a killer in the first place, but alas, humans never fail to surprise me. Coming up in our number 6 spot, we have Jarno Elge. Now, I may be pronouncing this wrong because this is a Finnish name, but bear with me. Jarno Elge was born in Finland in 1975, and apparently he always had a long history of violence towards animals. So then, knowing this shouldn't surprise you to hear that in 1998, Jarno entered the house of a 23-year-old man with some of his friends and proceeded to not only dissect the man, but to devour his insides. Apparently, his friends were very much into Satanism, and this was supposed to be a satanic ritual. In any case, Jarno was sentenced to life in prison, and his friends were sentenced to less than 10 years. So beware, because these human-eating zombies could be roaming the streets of Finland today. In our number 5 spot, we have Charles Domery. Charles was known as a Polish soldier who was alive between 1778 to 1800. He was known to have eaten 174 cats in a year. Oh, okay, really? Why wasn't this guy locked up? I'm so confused. Where were all the crazy cat ladies at this time? I would have been pounding down his door and demanding his arrest. Anyways, so for some reason, some guy got the bright idea to allow this guy to be a soldier and not hospitalize him, and of course, during his service, he attempted to eat a severed leg of one of his crew members. Apparently, the other crew members managed to get it off of him in time, thankfully, but clearly he was some form of a zombie that tricked a bunch of humans into thinking he was normal. In our number 4 spot, we have Jose Luis Calva. Jose Luis Calva was born in 1969 in Mexico City. Apparently, Jose had a very troubled life, experiencing being injured by his parents and the death of his father. So of course that leads us to better understand how he could have possibly gotten to a point of becoming a full-fledged human-eating zombie. Not fully understand, but better understand. In October of 2007, Jose was arrested after the police were on the hunt for his girlfriend Alejandra Galina, who had been missing. They found him eating a dish of human meat seasoned with lemon. Sounds like a classy guy to me. Bad joke. Apparently, they also found the body of the girlfriend in his closet. Her remains were scattered around the kitchen in cereal boxes, in the fridge, and some of her was still in the frying pan. Yikes. be careful who you date. In our number 3 spot, we have Yoo Young-chul. Yoo is known for being a South Korean serial killer and a self-confessed human eater. He lived in poverty growing up, being the product of an unexpected and unwanted pregnancy. Apparently, between the time of 2003 to 2004, Yoo killed 21 people. He would take their lives and then he would eat their raw flesh and livers. Whoa. He has been on death row in Korea for many years, and he has been deemed to have committed some of the worst acts in the history of Korea. In our number 2 spot, we have Otis Toole. Known for being an accomplice to serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, Otis himself actually confessed to taking the life of many people and confessed to many unsolved crimes. But not only that, unlike Henry, Otis was known to eat his victims. He actually confessed this in extreme detail to the police and to a comic book author who ended up publishing what he had said. He spoke about his enjoyment with eating humans and how he would eat them with his homemade barbecue sauce. Holy moly, that's horrific. In our number 1 spot, we have Alexander Spesitev. Alexander was born in 1970 in Russia, another name that was very hard to pronounce. Apparently, he had a horrible upbringing dealing with an unstable and violent father. Alexander was another case where he was found guilty for taking the life of his girlfriend, put in jail and a psychiatric institution, only to be released not long after. Why? I don't understand. Just stop releasing criminals. Anyways, he went on to taking the life of many people, some speculate over 80, and he would take the bodies home, cook them, and eat the meat with his mother. When he was caught, he was obviously ruled insane and sentenced to life in prison. His mother was also convicted as an accomplice. A mother-son human-eating duo. Just terrifying.
In our number 10 spot today, we have Dorothea Puente. You know the saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, this certainly is a case of that. If you took a glance at Dorothea and knew nothing about her, you'd probably assume she was someone's kind grandma who always had some cookies and a glass of milk waiting, but that could not be any further from the actual truth. She was actually a serial killer, and she decided to prey upon some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, people who were seeking help and assistance. Dorothea operated a large rooming house that was set in a large Victorian home in Sacramento, California. The residents who would often stay there were people who struggled with different substances such as alcohol, people who had been in mental hospitals, and the elderly. All of these people were receiving social security checks, and if they suddenly vanished, she figured no one would ask. In 1982, they did begin to vanish, but of course their social security checks were continually being cashed. Obviously, as it turns out, Dorothea was taking their lives and then their money. She has now been called the landlady from hell. In our number 9 spot today, we have Arne Johnson. This one is a little different because this person did not claim to be from hell, but rather that they had hell inside of them when they committed their atrocious crime. The trial was well known previously, but it has become even more widely spread as it was the trial that the newest Conjuring movie was based off of. In 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson killed 40-year-old Alan Bono, and what appeared to have just been a simple argument gone wrong quickly got a lot more convoluted and confusing. When it came to his defense for the crime, the devil made him do it. This was the first time that demonic possession had been used in an American courtroom as a defense. Arne had been at the scene of about 3 exorcisms that had occurred prior to his alleged possession, and this is why there really were some people who believed his story. At the end of the day, the jury in the trial decided to convict him of manslaughter. In our number 8 spot today, we have H.H. Holmes. I've definitely talked about this guy before in other videos because he is considered America's first serial killer, and he was especially gruesome. H.H. went to medical school, and shortly after finishing, he began killing people in order to steal their property. He built himself a huge, horrifying home that he had built to include things like secret passages and trapped doors. There were soundproof rooms, there were doors that only locked from the outside, and then they had gas jets on the inside of the room, and he even had a kiln to cremate the bodies. Not only would he get close to women so that he could take control of their finances and then kill them, but he would also require his employees to take out life insurance policies that named him as the beneficiary. It isn't exactly known how many victims he had, but it's thought to be somewhere over 200. He was sentenced to death when he was finally caught, and it is said that before his execution, he famously said, quote, "I was born with the very devil in me." I think that might just be something that me and HH can agree on. In our number 7 spot today we have Verkisto. This story is quite a bit different than the others on this list today for some obvious reasons. This story isn't coming from someone who has done a bunch of evil things, but instead coming from someone named Verkisto who says that they've met Satan upwards of 100 times and who is trying their best to stay as far away from him as possible. Verkisto described some extremely horrific things that they said they witnessed Satan do, and even said that they've experienced possession, influence, and oppression, all while battling Satan and his followers. They said that he would manifest himself and appear visible to even the naked eye, and apparently this was all so that he could check on the status of Verkisto's torment and demise. So far it seems that Verkisto has been able to steer clear of the whole demise thing, but this still sounds like a far from pleasant life. This story was posted on the internet in June of 2020, so hopefully by now maybe things are looking better for Verkisto. In our number 6 spot today we have Sam Little. Sam Little is well known for being one of the worst serial killers ever. He has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to definitively connect him to 30, they say they have no reason to doubt the validity of any of his other confessions. Sam was able to continue on his horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different counties, which made it way harder for them to be able to connect his crimes to each other. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, as they discussed religious beliefs, they spoke about the nature of sin. Sam stated he had no fear of God and said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything that he did. He also allegedly told a few select people that he believed that he was the devil. In our number 5 spot today we have Luis Garavito. Luis gained a nickname from the media of the Beast, and I think that's a great indication of the nature of his atrocious crimes. He is said to be one of the worst serial killers in the entire world, and it is believed that his victim count is up in the 300s range, which is absolutely shocking. He confessed to 147 crimes and he was found guilty on 139 of those counts, which put his sentence at 1,853 years. But here's the thing. This trial took place in Colombia where he lives, and apparently there is a law which puts the maximum sentence at 30 years. He was sentenced in 1999, meaning there's only a few years of his sentence left, and apparently there's a chance he could get out early for good behavior. According to Luis himself, he committed these crimes because he had made a deal with the devil, and he explained that satanic ritual was involved in all of his crimes. In our number 4 spot today we have Richard Ramirez. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of Los Angeles in the 1980s. He was known for his MO of invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was concerning to many people, especially during the height of the satanic panic. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of a crime, authorities became worried that he was a Charles Manson copycat, but instead he was just his own kind of monster. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, quote, "Hail Satan." In our number 3 spot today we have Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey is one of the most well-known serial killers, with his crimes taking place from 1978 to 1991. His crimes are much too brutal and horrifying to detail on this channel, but he is known for taking the lives of 17 different people. At his trial, not only did he plead not guilty, but his attorney had some interesting words for the court. His attorney stated that his bloody pattern had caused him to believe that he was the devil, which was intended to bolster his insanity plea. His attorney said, quote, "He became enamored, overwhelmed, caught up in the character in the horror movie Exorcist 3. The character was Satan because he was the personification of evil." Not only was Jeffrey found to be sane and ended up being sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, but not too long after his sentence started, he was killed by a fellow inmate. In our number 2 spot today we have David Berkowitz. Also famously known as the Son of Sam, David is a killer who didn't necessarily claim to be from hell, but placed his crimes on a demon who had taken the shape of of the dog that belonged to his neighbors. I know, I don't believe it either. Obviously. He led authorities on one of the largest manhunts ever seen in New York, as he left little notes behind trying to be arrogant, thinking he was invincible. Well, clearly he wasn't, as he was caught and convicted. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which, duh. But he did say that instead he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. In our number 1 spot today we have Ronald DeFeo. If you've seen Amityville Horror, in some ways you'll be familiar with this case, although the movie adds a strong paranormal aspect that most likely wasn't present in reality. Ronald was charged and convicted of taking the lives of his entire family, and earlier this year he passed away in jail at the age of 69. After his passing, certain letters that he had written were released. Before his death, Ronald had given many different accounts of what happened on that terrible night, which has made it impossible for anyone to really know for sure. While the entire case has become infamous, with many people believing that the crimes could be attributed to some kind of paranormal force, even Ronald himself stated, quote, "There was no demon. You know who the demon is. I am the demon." Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Nero. To start off this list, we are going to be taking it back all the way to the age of the Roman Empire. When we think back to these times, they weren't necessarily the most kind, peaceful of times, but there certainly are some characters that stand out as being particularly brutal, and one of those is Nero. Throughout his reign, he wreaked havoc on the Roman Empire, he burned cities, he killed thousands of people, including every member of his own family, and I mean, we know the inventive execution methods of the past, so you can probably guess at just how brutal these all were. Most Roman sources give us an almost completely negative review of him in reference to both his personality and his reign as a leader. He was called compulsive and corrupt, and it is believed that he is actually to blame for the great fire that burned Rome, but instead he used the Christians as a scapegoat so that they would receive punishments rather than him. Real stand-up guy. In the end, after being declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and realizing that the rebellion would be lost, he ended up taking his own life at the age of 30. In our number 9 spot today we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to have ever lived and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it did lead to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at the time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, which is a terrifying thought, but being eligible doesn't mean he's going to get it, so there's always hope. In our number 8 spot today we have Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine was a New Orleans socialite who was an evil person behind closed doors. It is said that in public Delphine was polite and appeared as if she cared for those who were enslaved in her home, which is truly the most bizarre sentence I've ever said, but I guess back then that was considered being a good person. I digress. Delphine's social standing remained until on April 10th, 1834, authorities responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. When they arrived and went inside, no one was prepared for the horrors that they were about to see, as they discovered bound slaves in her attic who had clear signs of violent behavior over a long period of time. Following this, her house was swarmed by an outraged group of New Orleans citizens, but somehow Delphine was able to escape with her family to France. While the angry group destroyed her entire home, Delphine never faced any punishments for her crimes, which is probably the most frustrating ending to this entire story. In our number 7 spot today we have Alexander Solonic. Alexander was known as Alexander the Great, but I'm not sure if great is the word I would use to describe him. He was a Russian gangster who was a pretty notorious hitman for the Russian criminal world. He started out as a member of the Soviet army, but he was quickly kicked out for his violence towards suspects. He actually ended up in prison for some of the things he did. After 2 years he ended up escaping, and this is when his contract killing career started. After a few years of living this life, he was apprehended by the police. police. Once at the station, he revealed a small automatic weapon that they had failed to find on him, and he opened fire on the officers. He ran outside where he hit 2 more officers, but he ended up cornered and hit by a shot himself. After being jailed for a second time, he ended up escaping from prison again, and this time he disappeared. He was later found in Greece with a fake passport, and it was here where he started his own little gang of around 50 men, which were of course all involved in shady activities. In 1997, however, his body was found just outside of Athens, and this time the tables had turned and he was someone else's victim. Authorities found evidence that he had been hired to carry out a hit in Italy before his death, and these two things just may be correlated. In our number 6 spot today, we have Elizabeth Wetlaufer. Elizabeth is a former registered nurse and serial killer who is responsible for taking the lives of 8 and attempting to take the lives of another 6 senior citizens who were under her care. With a total of 14 victims that either passed away or were harmed by her actions, she is now one of the worst serial killers Canada has ever seen. And not to mention how she was doing these things to vulnerable people that she was supposed to have devoted her life to taking care of. Her first victim who passed away was James Silcox, who was 84 in 2007 and was a World War II veteran. She committed her crimes by injecting insulin into her patients. In September of 2016, Liz ended up entering herself into a drug rehabilitation program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is located here in Toronto. It was here that she ended up confessing to her horrific crimes. Of course, the staff at the hospital notified the proper authorities, and she was subsequently arrested, and she gave police a 2-hour-long confession. She admitted to knowing that what she did was wrong, but she said she just had urges she couldn't control. She stated that, quote, God or the devil or whatever wanted me to do it. In the end, she was sentenced to life in prison, but because of the way that the Canadian system works, at some point she will be eligible for parole. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Lopez. Pedro is a man who lived a life committing some of the most horrific crimes I've ever even heard of throughout South America in the 1970s. By the time the 1980s rolled around, he made a mistake during one of his awful crimes, and this led to his arrest. Once in police custody, he began to basically explain his entire life story, and he confessed to an astronomical amount of crimes. People were a little skeptical of just how many crimes he said he committed, but Pedro was able to lead them to a mass grave where they recovered a total of 53 people's remains. Pedro, of course, went to jail, but get this, he was somehow released in 1994. I'm like, great. Just before I was born. Nice. He wasn't sent home straight away and instead was sent to some sort of mental institution for 3 years, but he was also released from there. Okay, so aside from the crimes he committed, are you ready for the worst part? In 2002, he was suspected of being the perpetrator of a new crime, but no one has been able to find him since 1998. Yeah, he disappeared. Awesome. In our number 4 spot today, we have Ilsa Cook. Ilsa is a war criminal who oversaw concentration camps that were run by her husband, Carl Otto Cook. She is well known due to her sadistic and brutal treatment of prisoners, and she became one of the first well-known people that committed these types of crimes to be tried by the US military. It is said that those being held at the camps with distinctive tattoos, Ilsa would take a piece of their skin as souvenirs. When being charged with her crimes, they included things like private enrichment, embezzlement, as well as taking the lives of some prisoners to prevent them from testifying. In the original trial, she was acquitted for lack of evidence, although her husband was sentenced to death by an SS court in Munich. After a few more trials, however, she ended up being sentenced to life in prison, and despite multiple appeal attempts, she was never released. In our number 3 spot today, we have Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a Georgian revolutionary and Soviet political leader who governed the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. Despite the fact that he started his time governing the country as part of a collective leadership, by the 1930s he had consolidated all of the power and went on to begin acting as the Soviet Union's dictator. During his reign, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of over 60 million people, 20 million of them being his own. Apparently the math works out to be about 40,000 people per week, which is truly unbelievable. It is worth noting, especially since this list is about people who were born evil, that there were good things that he did at some point or another. I mean, Stalin's forces did start out as an Axis power in World War II, and he did help us out a great deal, kill and helped to bring down you-know-who, but in the end, that good can't eliminate the harm that he did. Also, before he was in power, it is said that as a young man, he was a robber and an assassin. For almost 30 years, he reigned the Soviet Union with terror and violence. I mean, his decisions led to a famine that killed millions of people alone. Also, the lives he took weren't just of enemies. I mean, how could one person have 60 million enemies? He would take the lives of the families of people he liked. He just took too many lives, was too paranoid, and while he was powerful and smart, he was also an absolute monster. This is all perfectly summed up when he said, quote, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic." In our number 2 spot today we have Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the leader of the Cambodian revolutionary group called the Khmer Rouge, and this group, with him at the forefront, went on to try and destroy Cambodian civilization. This wasn't necessarily how the group started out, but once Pol and others who shared his ideas came to lead it, things quickly became dark. He is likely one of the only people who ordered a mass genocide in his own country. The reasoning behind all of this is because he believed that destroying the civilization was the best way to start a new regime and bring in a new age. He ended up serving as the prime minister from 1976 until 1979, during which his policies led to the deaths of around 2 million people, which is horrifying. That was about 25% of the entire population. He even liked to keep the skulls of those he had killed. I'm just gonna say, it seems as though politics was the mask for someone who just really wanted to kill. There are so many horrific details surrounding him and the things he did, some of which I can't even repeat here on YouTube, and that is exactly how he landed a spot here on today's list. He truly did some horrendous things and in the end went on to live the rest of his life and died of natural causes before he could answer for any of his crimes. In our number 1 spot today we have Heinrich Himmler. Alright, this is one real piece of work who was very active on what we'll call the bad team during World War II, and he is actually one of the people who really helped to create and build the Holocaust. He was the head of the SS and he controlled concentration camps, and you wanna know what he was best known for? His organizational skills and for picking the best subordinates. Yeah, they really liked him because he was able to pick the other best, worst people ever to work with him. That's absolutely insane. They say opposites attract, but in this case it was just terrible people joining other terrible people. He believed that certain groups of people, like Jewish people, were unworthy of living, and he himself ordered the deaths of 6 million. It is completely unimaginable just how evil this person really was. This hasn't exactly been verified, but it's something that's been said for years, and that is that he had furniture made from the skins and bones of these people. In the end, because he was nothing but a coward, when things for him and his party started to go south, he tried to have open peace talks with the Western allies behind the back of you-know-who. Of course, he found out and had Himmler dismissed from all of his posts and ordered his arrest. This led Himmler to trying to go into hiding, but he was detained and then arrested by British forces once his identity became known. To make the story even worse, while in custody he took his own life because of course he didn't want to answer for his terrible actions.